Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition here of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Christopher Shepard. Happy Tuesday to you all, and here on this Tuesday afternoon we should have another great show ahead for you, starting off by recapping that more than thrilling Monday Night Football game between the Bengals and Cowboys. What an exciting game that I was not expecting myself. Then our final fantasy regular season waiver wire update. These are the guys I truly can believe will help you in the postseason in fantasy. Continuing with my positional rankings, as always, my running backs and wide receivers for the final week of the regular season. And last but not least, concluding with my fantasy fact versus fiction. I feel like this segment will take on a different tone next week. We kind of recap the fantasy season, but ultimately I will love to conclude today's show with a bang, with one of my favorite segments I've introduced to this show. But without further ado, before we get into any of that fun stuff, let's remind you that if you want to continue getting content such as this, viewing content such as this, exclusive content from the show and the network, consider liking, following, and subscribing, not just to my show either. There are a lot of great people in the GSMC world doing a lot of great things, so many different shows you can tune into. But if you do wish to interact and contribute a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to get your opinions on air. Just leave a tip or donation. You can also do it through our website, gsmcspodcast.net, if you feel that way. But overall, it just makes this show that much more interactive, gets you, my faithful audience, involved as much as possible, ultimately just makes the show that much better. But without further ado, let us recap that very exhilarating Monday Night Football game from last night. And this game was a lot better than I expected it to be, and better than it should have even been. Bengals taking on the Cowboys on the road. Very exciting when ultimately the 27-20 victors in this game. And it very much felt like a game in which it could have gone much like how I saw it. Either the Cowboys defense locked in and kept it close and ultimately pulled this one out, or the Bengals offense ran roughshod over them. And we kind of got a mix of both in this one. There were moments of stellar offensive play from Cincinnati and moments where this Cowboys defense really proved that it's really found its footing these past couple of weeks. But ultimately, what I was talking about in the Cincinnati Bengals offense ultimately prevailed. Yes, it took a very bizarre blocked punt to do it, but it just goes to show that sometimes potent offenses like the Cincinnati Bengals can find ways to win in games such as these. But in terms of fantasy, it was a very exciting game. Definitely preparing you for your playoff push if you have some of these players here. But let's talk about potentially some other players as well in this segment who might not be on your fantasy roster that you might want to consider. So without further ado, let's recap this game. Joe Burrow, let's start off with him. He was perhaps the best performer in this one, continuing his MVP caliber play here. 33 for 44, 369 yards, 3 TDs, 1 interception for a total of 24.56 fantasy points, and he's just a paragon of consistency. If you're in the fantasy postseason and you believe that Joe Burrow is your guy, there should be no reason as to why you jump off this bandwagon right now. Yes, his team is out of it mathematically, supposedly. I still think that Joe Burrow is going to want to put as much into this season as possible, because this is a Bengals team that if all these contract situations get sorted out and, this defense under Lou Anarumo finds itself again, which I feel that they can do. It's just that a lot of defensive pieces from last year left, and they really didn't compensate for that very well in the offseason. I do believe that they can get things going, and it all starts with the excitement of Joe Burrow as your quarterback. When he's healthy, he's proven that he can be this MVP caliber player and is capable of leading you on a deep Super Bowl run. So next season, if they put all that together and the contracts figured out, then this team is going to be dangerous again. It's all going to come down to, though, that defense. And they really showed signs of what they can do in this one as well. So kudos to Joe Burrow maintaining his level of play in this one, even in what seemingly was a meaningless game. And then the Cincinnati Bengals defense finally stepping up in his stead. Let's talk about some other offensive stars. Perhaps an unsung hero here for Cincinnati last night. How about Chase Brown? Doing it both in the run game and the pass game. 14 carries for 58 yards, 6 catches for 65 yards, and 1 touchdown for a total of 24.3 fantasy points. And I know he's not someone in fantasy football circles that looks appealing on paper, but what I saw last night from him proved that he can be a very important piece of this Bengals offense in the future. A lot of people might not even think that in terms of fantasy playoffs, you should be looking towards the future as well, but it comes as par for the course here, right? Yes, you want to win your postseason games. Yes, you want to be your fantasy champion, but you also want to look ahead to the long-term future in terms of maintaining your fantasy consistency as well. And Chase Brown looks like one of those players who can carry over into next year and be a positive aspect of this Bengals offense. This Zach Moss acquisition was a failure, right? And I feel like Chase Brown, when he's on the field, just looks a lot more explosive, a lot more impactful in the Cincinnati Bengals offense than Moss ever was. And so that's why I feel like this game was a proving ground for what Chase Brown could be next year. And so I'm really happy to see a guy like Chase Brown do this during this time in the fantasy season, when a lot of people may be making last-minute decisions for the fantasy postseason, but also might be thinking ahead to next year. Because now he's going to be someone who might be a hotter commodity next year than right now. And so that's why I feel like this performance was very telling for him. And last but not least, let's talk about Jamar Chase. Might just be the best fantasy wide receiver to take into the fantasy postseason should you have him. 177 yards and 14 catches, 2 touchdowns for a grand total of 45.1 fantasy points. He is the guarantee at the wide receiver 1 position for me. Out of all these receivers, yes, you have your Justin Jeffersons. Yes, you have your CeeDee Lambs we played again last night, and also we're going to talk about in this one. But ultimately, Jamar Chase is someone who has developed such a rapport with Joe Burrow from his college career to now that he just is a stalwart player at the position in fantasy that you can't ignore no matter what. And even in this down year, even with all this rumors of contract situations and extensions and things of that nature, he still is a premier wide receiver in this league. And yes, depending on how this contract situation shakes out, if it gets finalized immediately during the offseason or it's put on the back burner for a while, he still is someone you're going to highly covet year in, year out for as long as the Bengals have this duo together, because it is the best in the National Football League, and they continue to prove it week in, week out, no matter the result. And that's why Jamar Chase, like I said, is the guarantee of the wide receiver 1 position out of all these different receivers. And ultimately, this was a good team win for the Bengals. Really showed how multifaceted they can be at their best. They finally got a fully complementary game from their defense, and Joe Burrow was able to get it done in crunch time like he knows how to. And that's the difference between these two teams. But on the Cowboys side of things, I don't think they should really feel as dismayed as they seemed last night. Obviously, we saw a very exasperated Micah Parsons on the sideline after that blocked punt and the resulting touchdown. So you can see that there is a lot of frustration when things go wrong for the Cowboys. But I feel like in some of these losses in this quote-unquote Cooper Rush era, they can keep their heads held high because they're not playing terribly. It's just that more often than not, these teams have some sort of aspect to them. For Cincinnati, it's their offense. For other teams, it could be their defense that really keys in on exploiting these Cowboys' weaknesses. And not for nothing, this isn't necessarily a weak football team right now. They know their strengths. It just came down to lack of execution in key moments. It came down to the Bengals really taking advantage of certain situations. But ultimately, This team played very well last night. I was very impressed by 3 individuals specifically. First, I started off with CeeDee Lamb because he deserves all the plaudits for technically keeping this offense afloat, despite all its limitations right now. He is an exemplary receiver at the end of the day, no matter what I think of this offense when it's just keyed in on him receiving the football. But I still think I can't judge him just on that alone because he truly is an exemplary receiver in this league. 6 receptions, 93 yards, 1 touchdown, 21.4 fantasy points for him. He's going to continue to do this as the season plays out. But one guy who I'm really happy to see continue this good stretch of form is Rico Dowdle. 18 carries, 131 yards, 15.1 fantasy points. And if they continue to rely on him in this offense from here on out, then I see there being a lot more bright spots to this Dallas offense next year than there was this year. So that's why I'm really excited about Rico Dowdle. And last but not least, let's talk about this competent, serviceable job that Cooper Rush is doing. He's not going to be a factor, let's be real here, in the fantasy postseason. But he is proving that he's one of the most competent backup quarterbacks in the NFL when things go wrong for Dallas. 16 of 31, 183 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, 13.82 fantasy points. Again, not big from a fantasy perspective, but still performance that merits consideration next year. If you're looking for, in a deeper league, a flex option, or say Cooper Rush after this signed somewhere else, where there's a more advantageous situation for him to get significant playing time, then he could potentially be a nice little QB2 or flex option in a deeper league, mind you. But overall, this Cowboys offense should keep their heads held high. They did a lot of great things last night, but there was just in key moments where they kind of let it slip, and ultimately the Bengals took advantage of that. But overall, very exhilarating game from last night. I did not expect as good a game as we got last night. But let me know what you think about it in the comments, because coming up next, we transition to our final waiver wire update of the fantasy regular season. These are going to be the guys who I believe can be hidden gems for you should you pick them up before the fantasy playoffs. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here, I do want to remind you that if you wish to contribute and interact with our show a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way as always to get your opinions on air. You can also do it through our website, gsmcpodcast.net, if you so choose, but either way, it is greatly appreciated by all concerned at the network and just makes our shows that much better. So without further ado, though, let us jump in right to our second segment of today's show, taking our final look at the waiver wire ahead of the fantasy playoffs. Now, these are truly some guys who have really come on these past couple of weeks and really proven that they can be hidden gems should you want to bolster your squad ahead of the fantasy playoff push. Now, these are all very risky players because of the lateness of their kind of reinvigoration, I should say. But I do feel like if you're in the fantasy playoffs, no matter how you got there, there's always room to add that one player who could be the difference down the stretch for you, because you don't want to leave it a chance. And even though, seeing as to how you're in the fantasy playoffs, you have a lot of good players there, maybe even some superstars, you'd always find one guy who you don't expect very often to carry you, but definitely could in these fantasy playoffs, and that could be all the difference that you need to win your league. So without further ado, let's talk about these certain players. Starting off with the young rookie in the New York system, New York Jets player. Very interesting career up to this point. Had basically not done anything for the first, 12, 13 weeks of the season, but these past 2 games, he's really come into his own, whether it be in the pass game, the short pass game, or the run game. And that is Isaiah Davis. He has scored 2 touchdowns in the past 2 games after scoring none over his first 13 or so career games. And that is truly remarkable for a Jets team that doesn't necessarily predicate itself on the run, but I would love to see more of that in this Jets team down the stretch, because they don't really have anything to play for right now. So why not develop certain players who you believe can be with you in the long run and really help you in this rebuild that you're going through, like an Isaiah Davis. That's why I feel like even though the Jets are the most appealing of fantasy teams at this point, mining them for young talent for your fantasy roster, for this fantasy playoff push, could be key, because I like what I've seen from Isaiah Davis as kind of this gadget player, short yardage situation back, and ultimately red zone threat these past couple of weeks. So that's why I'm really high on these low-end guys, maybe younger guys, in this fantasy playoff push than, say, some guys we've already talked about already. Because these are now the guys who are really stepping into big roles for these moribund teams who can really help you. And that's why Isaiah Davis can top this list. Another guy who's actually helped this team a lot in situations such as these as a Tampa Bay Buccaneer, with the frequent injuries to their 2 starting receivers this season. How about Jalen McMillan? We've talked about him a little bit in terms of how that whole injury fallout befell the Tampa Bay Buccaneers over these past couple of weeks, but he's really come into his own, had a couple TDs in that game against Las Vegas, and really proven that he can carry the load. He's more of a short yardage guy, more of a route running guy, more often than not gonna beat you with his intelligence and savvy rather than speed and verticality, but he really is a very smart football player. And should the Bucs really want to make that playoff push, he's going to have to step up for them, and he's proven he can. So if Baker continues to trust him, then chances are his fantasy production is going to skyrocket these next couple of weeks in heading into the fantasy playoffs. So that's why Jalen McCormick finds himself on this list as someone who, as a young player again, who's actually played more significant minutes than potentially a guy like Isaiah Davis in this receiving role, knows what he has to do on the stretch. And that's something important, because if you're looking for waiver wire pickups, sometimes it's nice to mine these kind of terrible teams for talent here. But there are also teams who are trying to make that playoff push in real life who have players who might have to step up, and that's where Jalen McMillan falls. And so if you're more comfortable with taking someone who's proven in a playoff caliber system that he can step up and mature and develop, then I feel like Jalen McMillan could be a better decision for you, even though he's at a much tougher position from a fantasy perspective than Isaiah Davis. And that's just my opinion, because both of these players have really come into their own this season, whether it be in small sample sizes or a bit bigger. But ultimately, these are the 2 guys who I feel like are the best of this list. Not to say these other 2 guys can help you, but ultimately these are the 2 guys who should define the waiver wire these next couple of weeks. And then 2 other guys I want to talk about really quickly. The first one being the guy who really has no choice in terms of how much of the load he's going to have to carry in this really terrible Las Vegas offense, Sincere McCormick. You had injuries to both Madison and White, 2 guys who you really thought were going to step up in those roles. You have injuries to both Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell that are season-ending, and for the life of me, I don't know what Desmond Ridder is going to look like in this Las Vegas Raiders system down the stretch here. But if you really want to spoil some people's seasons, Sincere McCormick could be the best guy to do it. He's also a rookie here, really going to have to step up these next couple of weeks. Most importantly, try and play for his NFL future, really, because if they see something in him, potentially he could be elevated to RB1 next season for Las Vegas and really help this rebuild, should they draft a high-level QB in this coming draft. So that's why Sincere McCormick could be a really intriguing player to tap into as well. I mean, not so much so over guys like Davis and McMillan who will look to have larger roles on this stretch, but if he does, then I do think that I feel like Sincere McCormick could be someone to look into. As Cam Daddy enters the chat, welcome to the show, my man. I believe this is your first time commenting, asking about some advice for the postseason. He's asking about some tight ends specifically. Hunter Henry, Evan Engram, Ertz, and Kincaid. Rank them. Half PPR league. Also, who would you rather have for playoffs? So the way I see it, this is in terms of talent, in my opinion. Potentially not in terms of fantasy, because the tight end position has been really weird this year in terms of fantasy. No one really separating themselves, in my opinion, as a premier tight end or in this kind of tier in my mind. No one's really elevated their status, so to speak. But if you just were to lay these tight ends out and ask me talent-wise, who would be the best, I would say Kincaid is the best, but in terms of health, he might not be the best option for the playoffs, and that might be something you might have to monitor. Then I would say Zach Ertz, surprisingly, because this Washington Commanders offense really predicates itself on really getting Jaden Daniels to remain as efficient as possible. And Zach Ertz, even though he hasn't had the best of seasons, still can factor in on the stretch for this Commanders offense just because of the fact that he can be an efficient route runner, especially in the red zone for a guy like Jaden Daniels. Then I'm going to say Hunter Henry because he has truly been this New England Patriots offense these past couple of weeks. He has been one of their best pass catchers, but the fact of the matter is, I don't really know week in, week out what the Patriots are going to look like offensively because Drake May is an excellent quarterback, no doubt about it, but if they end up passing so infrequently or too much, then that target share could get really weird in certain situations. And even though I love Hunter Henry and what he's doing for the Patriots, I don't really see him being efficient enough as well. It's had to learn also as that TJ Hawkinson could be a nice little tight end for you in the fantasy playoffs. And then last but not least, Evan Engram will be the last guy on my list because, let's be clear, I do think Evan Engram is the best route runner on the Jacksonville Jaguars. We see it when Trevor Lawrence is in there. He loves having a guy like Evan Engram. But the fact of the matter is, until this team really shapes up and really buys into the rebuild and accepts where they are, then I really don't know whether or not Evan Engram is even going to matter for this team going forward. And plus, he himself is also injury prone. So who knows there. But out of all these guys, in terms of playoffs, I would say Kincaid, just because of the fact he looks to be the most talented among this list. But Ertz is the safest bet because of the whole health situation. I hope this helps you. Good luck to you in your fantasy playoff exploits. Getting back into our final player here that you might want to look out for in the waiver wire. How about Jaylen Warren? I talk about the Steelers' running game a lot here, and I talk about Najee Harris a lot as well. But Jaylen Warren is a perfect complement to him. And if they want to lean a little bit more into the run game, the Steelers on the stretch, Jaylen Warren can do that in not just a chunk play kind of manner, but in more explosive manner as well. He can really be a threat in the open field, can really be a threat in the backfield as well. And so that's why I feel like Jaylen Warren could round out this waiver wire list. But then another comment from Captain Learn comes in here. Of Penix starts, watch out for hits to surprise. And this is talking about the Atlanta Falcons situation. This will close the segment here. I feel like Michael Penix, I don't necessarily know if he should start, right? Because they are still in a situation where with Kirk Cousins, they can win this division. Yes, it's looking a bit more tenuous now. Yes, Cousins is not looking his best. He has thrown 0 touchdown passes in his past 4 games. But to turn to a draft pick who has, yes, a lot of college experience in his career, but A, is also injury prone, and B, is also old. And you don't necessarily want to waste a season here, should you feel like Penix is the better option. Stick with Kirk Cousins, because either way, it's the path of least resistance, and I feel like he deserves a chance to right the wrongs here, because he's still got them to this position where they control their own playoff destiny. And Penix, I don't know if you throw him into the fire, he can really help the squad. As much as I think that Penix is a very talented quarterback and he'll prove that, I don't necessarily know if asking him to go out and get them into the playoffs is really tenable here. And I feel like that's going to be the issue. But ultimately, Pitts is a guy who's been underwhelming this year anyway, so I wouldn't necessarily feel like, whether it's Penix or Cousins, that he would really be a surprise down the stretch here. But let me know what you think about these comments in the comments below. But coming up next, we continue our positional rankings with the running back position. Final positional rankings continue here for the regular season right after we come back from this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search...
Hello everyone, and welcome back in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day here on today's show, we're going to be continuing our final regular season positional rankings with our running backs. Now, you might already have your mind made up about the running back position because of its volatility. I choose to beg to differ, because it's always going to be difficult, whether you're in the regular season or the fantasy playoffs, for a running back to catch fire, because you always feel like, oh, this guy's going to be a hidden gem this year, when in fact, I feel like the position is so top heavy that even the guys who are competent enough to start for you week in, week out in fantasy kind of fall to the wayside a little bit, kind of lose their luster. But as we head into the fantasy football playoffs, these are the guys who really, in my mind, have set themselves apart as four premier guys up and down the gamut here. Not just superstars, but guys who can be consistent from a fantasy standpoint, who can really separate themselves in this fantasy postseason. They're all playing meaningful games on the stretch as well. Very tough games for some of them, but ultimately they're going to really prove their mettle for you in a fantasy playoff setting. So without further ado, let's jump right into them. Let me see, yes. Starting off with Bijan Robinson against the Saints. Now, if you know, the Falcons' quarterback situation is as muddled as people think it is, and they really are thinking of leaning into Penix being their starter, then Bijan Robinson, I feel, would be the biggest beneficiary. Because I feel like if you toss Penix into the fire, you're going to have to rely a lot on Bijan Robinson, because of the fact that he needs a competent backfield partner. And while, you know, Bijan has been kind of disappointing this season, he only had 10.1 fantasy points versus Minnesota, and it seems like this offense is a little bit more explosive with Tyler Allgeier in there, he still offers you a lot more in terms of explosiveness, in terms of being a better pass catcher, and ultimately helping this possible transition at the quarterback position for Atlanta, should it happen. But ultimately, you know, whether or not it's Cousins or Penix, Bijan Robinson always has to be the guy in the backfield who has to step up. And I think that a major part of their offensive struggles is because they don't necessarily rely on him too often. And when they do, I feel like it's both a combination of him not necessarily trying as hard in this offensive line, not blocking well for him. It's a very weird situation there, but ultimately I feel like this is the game where he gets right against the Saints' porous run defense. So look for Bijan Robinson, whether it's Cousins or Penix, at the helm next week, to truly be someone who starts to come into his own on the stretch here, much like a lot of fantasy football owners thought he would do earlier in this campaign. So that's why I feel like Bijan Robinson is still boom or bust, but could potentially reap the benefits for you in fantasy this playoff season. And then the second guy I want to talk about, coming off a bye, really going to have to be important on the stretch with this team. One of the most difficult schedules remaining in the AFC. They really not looked like a playoff team, but this guy can be the X factor for them no matter what. And that is Joe Mixon in this offense. Going up against the Dolphins, who are going to be a tough out. I still think that they have a chance mathematically to get into the postseason and make some noise as well. So you never want to underestimate teams like the Dolphins on the stretch if you're the Texans, especially if you're the Texans. And Joe Mixon has proven they can carry the load for this offense in many different ways. And maybe they don't necessarily rely on him as often as one would like as a Texans fan because of the fact, that they still think Stroud is talented enough to really be the difference in a lot of games. But the fact of the matter is this offensive line has been playing terribly. A lot of penalties on these past couple of weeks. And Stroud is getting pressured far too often. The second most sacked quarterback in the NFL. Keeping bad company with Caleb Williams up there. So in order to alleviate all that pressure, you're going to have to rely on a guy like Joe Mixon. And what's the perfect time to do it than after the bye, when you're starting to fix and adjust mistakes you made early in the season. And I think DeMeco Ryans is smart enough to know that he has a defense that's fantastic enough to complement this offense, no matter how rocky it gets on that side of the football. And as a defensive-minded coach, knows that running the football really helps his game plan a lot more. This is not an indictment of C.J. Stroud. He's still the excellent quarterback we know him to be from his rookie season. It's just that he's having a difficult year. He's getting a lot more pressure on him. And this offensive line is not playing like it was much of last year. And so that's why the guy like Mixon, now more than ever, can stand down on this team. This is when he carries the load. This is when he assumes a much bigger role on the stretch. Because if you get into the playoffs and you're up against, say, a very physical team defensively, instead of the Steelers, the Chargers, or even the Ravens, maybe even the Chiefs as well, I'll throw in there. Chances are you're going to have to try and establish a run game, to try and play keep away, and try and play complementary football most importantly, which is what I think the Texans are the most good at, or what they can be the most good at down the stretch here this season. And it all comes back to Joe Mixon and what he brings to this offense. So look for them against the Dolphins, a perfect test, because this is a real trap game for them. And these games are not going to get any easier on the stretch. I still think they have the Chiefs and the Ravens on the stretch as well. But ultimately, Joe Mixon can really right the wrongs of what's been happening with the Houston Texans offense. So look for them to really lean on him down the stretch here and potentially make people happy from a fantasy perspective in the playoffs. And then these last two guys I want to talk about obviously could be very capable starters already for you this season and heading into the playoffs. Saquon Barkley first, talking about him in this very important matchup against the Steelers. 14.4 fantasy points against Carolina. Certainly not his best game, but still, he broke the franchise record for yards, and he's on pace to surpass Eric Dickerson this season in terms of the single-season rushing record. And so, in this matchup, yes, it's going to be a difficult one, but ultimately Saquon looks to be the best player in this matchup, the most important player in this matchup, and he most likely will be in the playoffs as well, because I feel like this is the Eagles' MO here. They're a control the ball, beat you with their defense, have a football team, and Jalen Hurts is going to take a little bit of a back seat. It's going to frustrate a lot of people, but it's going to be to the advantage of Saquon Barkley owners on the stretch. And I think a lot of people truly appreciate a team like the Eagles, surprisingly, because of that fact. Because of the fact that there are so few running backs like Saquon Barkley who can take command of an offense like this. And they're hard to come by, especially deeper in fantasy football drafts when you might be looking at running backs. So if you're a Saquon Barkley owner, use him while you still have him. And hopefully, he'll be enough in the fantasy playoffs to really make your team stand out and make you feel like you're competing at a high level. Because at the end of the day, there are very few fantasy running backs who are this far ahead of the pack in what they're able to do. And look around the league, yes, Derrick Henry can play a big role. This next guy that I'm talking about can play a big role. And ultimately, these other two guys, Joe Mixon and Bijan Robinson, when their O-lines are on, ultimately can play a big role for you. But they're not at the level of Saquon, who can just control a game start to finish with his style of play, with his physicality, with his explosiveness. And as a result, put up the stats you like to see from a fantasy perspective. So that's why Saquon is unmatched. No matter what his matchup is, no matter what you think of him, no matter who has him, he's unmatched in terms of fantasy production at the running back position. And so, even though it's going to be difficult, if you don't have a guy like Saquon, these other three guys, this last guy who I'm going to mention, certainly can't help in that department. But Saquon, just know that if you have him, he's most likely going to carry you to victory more often than not, just because of what he means to this Eagles offense. And like I said, even in this tough game, this tough environment, it's going to come down to this battle of the trenches. I feel like Saquon is always going to be the difference and X factor, especially down the stretch in the NFC and in the NFC playoffs as well. So that's why I feel like you can't ignore what Saquon Barkley is doing. But if you want another high-end back who's not necessarily at the same level as Saquon Barkley, but is still a very competent back who could be an RB1 already for you right now, Josh Jacobs. And I hate to say it because he's going up against my Seahawks this Sunday night, but Josh Jacobs really is one of the sneakier fantasy running backs this season. A lot of people thought his career was finished. He was on a downward slope coming out of his last season in Las Vegas, and nobody really thought that even though he was in a good situation with Green Bay, that he would really stand out. And stand out he has, though. And these past couple of weeks have really proven that the Packers feel like Josh Jacobs gives their offense a whole new dimension. And to be honest with you, I feel like this Green Bay receiving core this season is a little bit kind of underrated. But I feel like they're still a little bit raw in nature, that you can't necessarily trust them in big games. And plus, this is only Jordan Love's second season as a starter as well. So down the stretch, I think we're going to see a lot more Josh Jacobs as well. And I feel like this game will be defined by who wins the trenches as well, because both of these teams have proven that when their offensive line is in rhythm, they can get their running backs going. Seattle a little bit less so, and only last week did we really see a stellar running performance from them. But definitely the Packers. So if they can get the Josh Jacobs train rolling, then this could be a very tough out for Seattle, at least in the run game. Because that's where I feel like the Packers feel they can exploit a team like Seattle. Because that's the thing. They haven't necessarily played well against NFC teams. The best moments where they play against NFC teams have come from Josh Jacobs taking control of that game. And he looks to be a stalwart running back. As Tap to Learn also inquires about dark horse quarterbacks, and this will close the segment as well. I feel like in terms of dark horse running backs, it's really dependent on, what you think about certain players. Because I could say a guy like Isaiah Pacheco could be a dark horse running back in the stretch, or a guy like Gus Edwards. But these are two guys who really, if you look at it, have completely underperformed this season. So I feel like if you want a dark horse running back, it's going to have to come from a team or a player who truly exemplifies someone completely out of the radar. Not necessarily someone you would have even in your second or third tier. And I would say, and this is not to toot the Seahawks' horn, that if Zach Charbonnet continues to see more time, depending on the status of Kenneth Walker, that he has a good chance. I also think that, James Conner can be a factor in the fantasy plays, because I feel like these past couple of weeks have shown that the Cardinals haven't been consistent if James Conner hasn't been consistent. And so they continue to feed James Conner, chances are he's going to up his numbers again, and chances are you're going to see an uptick in his fantasy production as well. So while he's not a dark horse, and a lot of people actually commenting on this show really love him as much as I do, I do think that he's still a quote-unquote dark horse just because of these past couple of weeks. Another guy to conclude the segment, how about Tyrone Tracy? Because this is someone who really has emerged more as a dark horse role, really doesn't necessarily pop off the page when you first see him, and then these past couple of weeks has really come into his own, has truly been the Giants' best player, and thus I feel like a lot of people are really excited to see what he can do in a fantasy playoff setting heading into next season as well. So those are the guys who I think are dark horse, but these 4 guys can be the difference for you in the fantasy postseason. I'm going to continue to know what you think in the comments below, because we're going to transition to a less difficult position to analyze for our next positional rankings with the wide receiver position. All of these guys I'm going to be talking about did not play this week, but still, after their buys, look for them to be hungry and ready to perform for you in a fantasy setting. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about them.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our 4th segment, we'll continue with our positional rankings with a lot more easy position to talk about in terms of a fantasy standpoint, the wide receiver position, because really this is such a deep talent pool to kind of pick from. You don't really have to rely too much on superstar receivers. Like myself, I always love balance. And this season, while balance quote-unquote kind of failed me as I missed my personal fantasy football playoffs, I feel like if you have 2 receivers who play off each other so well, with consistent 15 to 20 point performances, you should be good. But ultimately, what you are looking for in the fantasy playoffs is that one performance that can put you over the top by one specific player who is a superstar at his position. And you can most likely get it from the wide receiver position. And like I said, all 4 of these guys, while only one played this week, are on buys, and they're all meaningful players who can mean a lot to their teams in the stretch. And so that's why I feel like even if you may not like these rankings, chances are you still can rely on players such as this in the fantasy playoffs, because these are the guys who I feel are a little bit more balanced. Some of them are capable of hitting those superstar numbers, the high 30s, high 40s for you, but I still think that if you're like me and care about balance in your squad, then I do feel like this is the lineup for you in terms of these wide receivers who I think can perform. And then, without further ado, let's jump right into these guys here. Starting off with Terry McLaurin, coming off a bye, going against the Saints. The Commanders are a team who I feel like over this bye might have decided that they need to incorporate a lot more running into their game, because their rushing attack can really be the difference in how far they could be able to go in the postseason should they get there. But Terry McLaurin's still the elite athlete that a lot of people think he really is. And combined with Jaden Daniels, who's unafraid to throw him the football and really bring out this vertical passing game, Terry McLaurin is going to see a lot of targets on the stretch. And they have an easy slate ahead, potentially trap games in the final week of the season against the Cowboys, and then a couple weeks from now against the Eagles. But I do feel like the Commanders are in prime position to get back to what we know they can be against these easier opposition. Against the Saints, who, yes, are playing with passion, but really do not want to play a team like the Commanders, who are coming off a tough stretch after a bye, and a guy like Terry McLaurin, who you know can get hot any time. So Terry McLaurin definitely can be that guy, again, who can consistently deliver for you in terms of the 15 to 20 point range, but also has the potential to hit those big numbers for you, the high 30s, high 40s, like I say. That's why I feel like, in terms of my wide receiver rankings, I wanted to be a little bit even here. I wanted to be a little bit more even keel in who I picked in terms of how they project these final couple of weeks. And then the second guy, this is kind of a riskier option. This is more of a matchups-oriented one. Definitely not a guy who I would completely start in a fantasy playoff setting, but Marvin Harrison Jr., should you have him still, potentially as a flex option going against the Patriots. Only had 8.9 fantasy points against Seattle, and really has been disappointing these past couple of weeks. But still, I know, highly capable of delivering on the biggest stages for you in terms of how it projects down the stretch for this Cardinals team, who still technically is in the race, but definitely needs a lot more output and production from a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr. And I feel like, if Kyler Murray just gets back to throwing him the football a lot more and trusting him a lot more in this system, then should be fine, because down the stretch, they have a pretty easy schedule. By no means are they completely out of this race, and they're going to prove it should they continue to trust Kyler Murray and continue to believe that Marvin Harrison can be his top target these next couple of weeks. That's why I feel like Marvin Harrison, even though a lot of people might not still have him on the roster and might not even be in starting lineups in fantasy playoffs everywhere, could still potentially, if you do have him on the roster, fit the flex position for you down the stretch because of the easy nature of the Cardinals' schedule. And then the third player that I want to talk about here, also coming off the bye, potentially a sneaky player that people have kept around on their fantasy rosters that made it into the playoffs and made the cut, so to speak, in terms of which players you wanted to take into the postseason. How about Zay Flowers? Another kind of matchups-oriented one coming off the bye. I feel like the Baltimore Ravens, what they should have focused on was getting the ball to a guy like Zay Flowers. Because when I look at the Baltimore Ravens, I've watched a lot of their games. What I see kind of is stagnation in certain areas of the field, in electricity and electrifying plays as a result in other parts of the field. And most of that comes down to, the stop-start nature of the vertical passing game in this Ravens offense. We know that Lamar is capable, but we haven't really seen him need to take those deep shots as often. But Zay Flowers can be someone who can come into the spotlight a little bit more if the Ravens down the stretch need a play like this. And so against the Giants, he might not even play that well. But just know that Zay Flowers can catch lightning in a bottle at any moment because of the nature of this Ravens offense. It's a little kind of stop-start, like I said, in terms of how he plays. But ultimately, I feel like this is the guy who a lot of people are not going to want to miss out on over these next couple of seasons, because he has the potential to be a breakout candidate for this team. And it's going to depend a lot on whether or not, the Ravens trust certain players over others in this offense as well, because they still have guys like Derrick Henry. They still have guys like Mark Andrews, who we all know are stellar in terms of their fantasy production as well. And I feel like they have more of a chance to stand out over a guy like Zay Flowers. But Zay Flowers could be a sneaky guy that can win you a fantasy football league this season, should you still have him on your roster. This is more of a long-term look at a player who I believe can develop into a stud for this Baltimore Ravens offense and help it progress potentially in terms of how vertical it can look in the future. But for now, this is just a guy who I'm really monitoring in these fantasy playoffs and seeing if he can live up to the hype as potential dark horse receiver that can win you fantasy football leagues this season. And against the Giants, you could have a unique opportunity against a defense that feels down and out to do just that. And the last fantasy player I want to talk about in the wide receivers before we kind of conclude it here for the regular season. How about Nico Collins coming off the bye, going up against the Dolphins? Pick two highly rated Texans offensive players in both of my rankings this week, because these are the two guys, right? If you really want more offensive production, you need to feed these two guys. And Nico Collins is perfectly capable of it. I feel like after the injury, right, is more of a rhythm thing, trying to get back into the swing of things that kind of slowed him down. But now he's in a position where he can really, truly stand alone as someone who can carry the load down the stretch for this Texans offense. And so, again, in this potential trap game against the Dolphins, you're going to need these difference makers to stand out. And while I do feel like this Texans passing attack is a little bit more staid than others and really is now going to test the Miami Dolphins defense as much as I think it will, Nico Collins still could take opportunities to really stand out and really show that he is the elite premier receiver we know him to be. And it could be a different question next year when Stephon Diggs comes back, and he might demand a little bit more attention in terms of target share. But for now, Nico Collins is still the man for me in Houston. And on the stretch, I feel like he's going to perform at a very high level once again because of the fact of this team really dipping into their depth here and trying to find ways to overcome limitations and deficiencies they have and not really finding that much consistency with them. So Nico Collins is made ever more prevalent in his importance to the squad because of the fact that I really don't see, outside of Joe Mixon and Nico Collins, players who can step up. They don't necessarily rely on a guy like Dalton Schultz. Robert Woods and Xavier Hutchinson haven't really stepped up in their stead. John Mechie, we really don't know what's going on with him as well. You still have Tank Dell, but he's also very injury prone. So it's really going to come down to these two guys, is what I'm saying. Joe Mixon and Nico Collins. They're going to determine the Texan season, potentially your fantasy season. Because from a fantasy perspective, Nico Collins is still the guy. I can attest to that last year when he really had his breakout season. You definitely don't want to feel like you're missing out should you not start Nico Collins in the fantasy playoffs, because he has the ability, and all of these guys have the ability to really be the difference for you in the fantasy playoffs because of the fact that, like I said, they're balanced receivers when all is said and done. They're consistent. You can do whatever you need them to, whether it get you 15 points or 40 points. They can get the job done for you. And so that's why I really think this wide receiver position this season has been so special, because a lot of people are able to tap into the depth at the position and not necessarily have to worry about any deficiencies and limitations in their wide receiver rooms, because you know you have a deep wealth of talent at your disposal. And thus you feel like you can rotate a little bit more and more. But ultimately, talking about this position is always fun because it's such an easy position to analyze, and I know it sounds cliche as someone who talks about all these different positions all the time, but I do appreciate the top wide receiver position, because even though it's tough being a deep pool and not, quote unquote special, where you're positioned like a running back or tight end and you have one or two hidden gems and superstars and the rest kind of fall to the wayside. You're a very well balanced position. You don't get talked about enough. It's still one of my favorite positions in fantasy just because of the production you receive from it. So be mindful of that heading into the fantasy playoffs. But let me know what you think about the position in the comments. But for our final segment, it's our final regular season fantasy fact versus fiction segment, justifying and debunking some fantasy claims for this last regular season game of fantasy football. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our final segment of today's show, let's talk about the fantasy fact of fiction. One of my favorite segments to bring into the show, justifying and debunking bold fantasy claims week in, week out. It's going to come to a conclusion, not necessarily in terms of predictions that I'm able to make here, but from a regular season perspective, talking about important games that will get you into the fantasy playoffs. And even if you are already in the fantasy playoffs, it's always a fun segment to conclude my Tuesday show. So without further ado, let's jump into the final, quote-unquote, meaningful one for the regular season. So let's start off with a game that I feel like is going to be determined, like I said, in the trenches, because both of these teams are very strong in those areas. Both offensive lines are good, both defensive lines are good. So it's going to really come down to complementary football and which offense can get it going. Because I think that the Steelers against the Eagles is going to be a defensive slugfest. I can firmly put that in the fact camp here, because of the fact that I think both of these teams have quarterbacks who are highly capable of delivering downfield for them. Jalen Hurts is an exceptional downfield passer when his game is on with A.J. Brown, and I know they're having complicated situations right now in that regard, but I still think that at the end of the day, you can never doubt Jalen Hurts as a passer. And so that's why I feel like the Eagles have that second gear in them, but are still very going to be much reliant upon Saquon and his play in this game. Whereas the Steelers also kind of play this complementary style. Not necessarily more of a running team, because Russell Wilson is more apt to throw the deep ball than Jalen Hurts, and he loves his connection with George Pickens, and he loves having different receivers at his disposal that he feel can exploit certain coverages. But I do think that they're a very complementary offense, because Najee Harris is someone who can get going. We see that Jalen Warren also complements that backfield so well. But ultimately, this is going to come down to the defensive slugfest that I feel is going to ensue. And so you might not necessarily roster many people from this game for your first fantasy playoff game, but it's still going to come down to how they utilize their philosophies. If Russell Wilson can get a couple deep shots in this game, if Saquon Barkley sets the tone, then you can feel as if there's fantasy production to be had here. If not, then you might want to shy away from this one. But we just know that there is more talent here than you think. It's just going to have to come from special play, because both of these defenses are really locked in. I don't see how it's not going to become an ugly game determined by one or two miracle plays. So that's what I think of this one. So then the second one I want to talk about here is about Jaden Daniels, because this is an offensive rookie of the year race that might not be decided yet in people's minds. We talked about it a little bit before last week, but I do think that coming off the bye, he's going to distance himself I don't think he's going to distance himself in the offensive rookie of the year race with a top 5 performance. I think he's going to be efficient in this game. I think this Commander is going to look good coming out from the bye against this very weak Saints team, who has won 3 of 4, I must add, but really aren't necessarily playing for much here, and have lost Derek Carr for the season, for that matter. Jaden Daniels is going to prove that he is still in this offensive rookie of the year race very firmly, but not necessarily distance himself, because I do think Bo Nix is a case as well. And the fact of the matter is, Jaden Daniels is more efficient than productive, in my opinion. He only has 15 touchdowns to his name for the year this season. And he doesn't have many yards either to speak for himself. And so that's the thing that really makes this offensive rookie of the year race a lot more heated than people realize it is. And while I do think Jaden Daniels has a bit of the upper hand because he looks the more explosive of the two, I do feel like Bo Nix is still in this because of the way he's matured in the Sean Payton offense, because of the fact that offense really has been clicking these past couple of weeks and has gotten them into that wildcard slot in the AFC, whereas the Commanders have had rough stretches this season and haven't really proven they can maintain that level these past couple of weeks. And so that's why I feel like while Jaden Daniels is firmly in this discussion and continues to prove it through his efficient style of play, he's not going to quote-unquote distance himself, and he's not going to be, in my opinion this week, a top 5 fantasy performer. So that's why it's in the fiction camp. And then the third one I want to talk about, let's talk about the Raiders defense, because that's a unit for the Raiders that's been playing with passion. Them being fantasy sleepers. This is firmly in the fact camp. A lot of people might have already made up their minds going into the playoffs about which defense they want to stick with. But defense, like I said, is another one of those volatile positions where you can pick up someone and feel comfortable starting them week in, week out. It's just a game of craps, I guess. You have to kind of pick and choose your battles here. But the Raiders defense has proven that out of all of these quote-unquote moribund teams, and they have a defense more than capable of giving you solid fantasy output. And not for nothing, this is a defense that, yes, has so much pressure on it because of the fact this offense is terrible. And what it looks like from here on out with Desmond Ridder at quarterback beats me. But I still believe that the players here are better than the sum of their parts. It's just that they're in a very difficult situation. Look at what Max Crosby is doing this season. He's played over 750 defensive snaps. He has been a true warrior, a true maverick at that defensive line position. And he's really proving himself to be a dark horse defensive player of the year candidate. If you know Las Vegas is a better team than what their record shows. But at the end of the day, we don't necessarily think of the Raiders defense because of how bad they are right now. But ultimately, down the stretch, they're going to be the most important factor for what the Raiders look like in these meaningless games. Because if they want to play spoiler, they have the defense to do it. But it's all going to depend on if the offense complements them well. And that's the thing, because I think the Las Vegas Raiders are closer to contention than we think. And yeah, you know, if that whole package deal of the Sanders family coming to them means anything, then I do think, you know, that there can be excitement around this team yet again. But I think you're going to have to invest in this defense and its talent there if you really want to make this a contending team, because I do really love this team. But in these next couple of weeks, the fantasy playoffs, if your defense isn't defined just yet, look for them to potentially be the team you might want to look at. And then the last one I want to talk about, let's talk about a player who's kind of lit up these past couple of weeks in terms of his play at the wide receiver position, proving the depth of the wide receiver position here. Let's talk about Jerry Jeudy. Lighting it up potentially against the Chiefs, I think is firmly in the fiction camp, because Jerry Jeudy, yes, because of Jameis Winston, has seen his stats skyrocket, has seen his production go up, has seen his target share go up, what have you. But I do think that against the Chiefs, in a game that I do feel like could be very thrilling to watch, and very, very high scoring at that, I feel like Jerry Jeudy is one of those guys who I can't fully commit to continuing hot streaks, because he is a stellar receiver for this Browns team. He's proven that. He is a very savvy route runner, very speedy, very vertical in nature. But at the end of the day, against the Chiefs team that, yes, you can exploit their deficiencies, but are still better than you, I feel like Jerry Jeudy is someone who I can't really justify in terms of continuing the stretch, because the Browns, let's be real, are a very fun team, but they're not a very good one. And as long as Jameis Winston has this nature to throw picks, they're going to be a roller coaster ride, where one day they can put up 40 points on you, but because of Jameis Winston's picks the next day, they can only put up 14 or so, much like they did this past week against Pittsburgh, where after that exciting offensive showcase against Denver that last week, they kind of fell flat because of Jameis. And for nothing, Jerry Jeudy had a long touchdown in this game, but if you're relying on a quarterback who's very prone to turning the ball over to throw you the football, chances are more frustration is going to set in. And so that's why, as much as I love Jerry Jeudy when he's done these past couple of weeks, really skyrocketing in the passing yards charts as well. putting up insane numbers. This is a team that is too roller coaster to really invest in. And so as much as I love a lot of these Browns players, as long as Jameis makes those mistakes, I can't really say they're going to separate themselves in this one. Ultimately, this will just about do it for today's show. I love talking about fantasy fact or fiction as always, but at least for the regular season, it's going to come to a close. But this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always for the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back here tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time for another great show. Like, follow, and subscribe. Continue making yourselves available to the Super Chats, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. But other than that, I am out for today.